Today's lecture is going to cover the economic and political pressures that cities face. This is in part to sort of explain what we can conclude, partially from Malat's claims that cities are growth machines. So, in his paper that we read, he gives an argument for why we should think of cities as growth machines and the problems with this. So the negative consequences that arise from this. And so if cities and those leading cities want that city to grow, given the sort of pressures that cities are under, we can derive certain conclusions about what will happen. So what will happen to cities. So that's what this lecture will help explain. The next lecture, which should be up tomorrow, will just go through the Malat article in more detail and sort of go through any difficult details that you might not have understood. First, we're going to talk about the sort of political pressures that cities are under. And the most important thing to understand about cities is that they derive all of their powers from the states. So, and by this I mean, the states of the Union, like Alabama or California. So, under the U.S. Constitution, states have certain powers that the federal government cannot impinge on, and the state can then give those powers to different entities. And this can include different areas, so different counties, towns, and cities. So cities are historically one of the main entities that have power to govern themselves, and this power is given to them by the states. So these are usually done in things called home rule charters. And so these are either in state constitutions or formed by legislatures themselves. So the important distinction here is, if a given entity, or if if an entity is given explicit sort of rights in a constitution. So in some constitutions, major cities are named, right, in the constitution itself and given certain rights, or there's some sort of process by which people can come together and agree to be a city or be a county or something, and then they are automatically given certain rights. So in that case, the state cannot just come in and change things because it's in the Constitution that this city or whatever has certain rights. So the legislature cannot make laws that violate that part of the Constitution. However, if the legislature is what is giving these cities or counties rights, then they can do whatever they want if they want to. Usually they don't, because generally people like local governance, and if they see the state sort of meddling in local governments, that makes them very uncomfortable. So generally legislatures stay away, but sometimes they don't, and we see this I think in the capital, Pennsylvania, was having fiscal problems, and the state actually came in and put a board in place that was not elected by the people living there. And the reason they can do this is because the state is the one who actually has the authority to go in there. So these rights are usually limited by various things. So this differs based upon state. So every state has its own constitution, and so these sort of rules will differ. But generally, there's a few things that cities can't do. So they can't, contradict state laws. So they can't pass their own law that violates a state law. For instance, if there's, this is one that's relevant now. If there is a gay marriage ban in the entire state, generally a city can't just allow gay marriage to happen in that city, because that would contradict a state law. And so there's other things like that. So any law that would violate state laws is not allowed. Oftentimes there's legislative oversight of cities, and they can step in if needed, if the legislature deems it appropriate, depending upon the sort of rights the city is given in the Constitution or in other laws. And cities can't just pass laws that directly affect other jurisdictions outside of their city, which is pretty obvious, and there's a lot more. And so also what's important here is cities, so their finances are sort of backed by the finances of the state. So states, can bail out cities. They can, and it's understood that if a city can't pay debts, the state is on the hook, so to speak, to pay them. In this sort of situation, the state might come in and take things over and put an emergency fiscal board or something. So that's what you need to understand about the authority given to cities in normal contexts. And next we'll talk about Baltimore, which is in the normal context, and Washington D.C., which is not in the normal context. So Baltimore has home rule granted by the state constitution. It's a special entity in Maryland. There's no other entity in Maryland like Baltimore, which makes sense because it's the largest city in Baltimore. So the state has certain emergency powers, and Baltimore laws have to follow the normal sort of rules that I laid out in the previous slide. But generally, Baltimore has a lot of leeway as far as budgeting, incurring debt, using its institutions to do various things, and raising money. Washington, D.C., however, is very different. So Washington, D.C., as you probably know, is not a normal city. It's not a state. It's this special place, very special place, special entity set aside by the constitutions, by the U.S. Constitution. And the idea was that this should be a place separate from all the states. So it shouldn't be part of a single state. And, the thinking, I think, was, well, it'll just be people who are in the legislature and who work for the government and such. But today, there are nearly 600,000 people in the district, and that's probably not what they intended. So, so it's supposed to be this set-aside place just for government matters, and now lots of people live here. So keep that in mind. So the 23rd Amendment, so originally, everyone in the city had basically, no sort of voting rights. They had no representation, even for president. So in the 23rd Amendment, it granted them the right to vote for president, and they had representatives in the Electoral College, which allowed them to basically vote for president. That was in 1961. And then in 1973, they were granted home rule rights. So before this time, so before 1973, D.C. was managed by the House of Representatives. So there was this committee. Actually, it was the worst committee to have, essentially, because no one cared about, who really wants to run a city, a small, relatively small city by their standards, if, you came to Congress to do work in the federal government. So no one wanted to be on it, and it seemed to often be chaired by segregationist Southerners. So these white Southerners who, did not basically like the residents of the, mostly African-American District of Columbia. So this brought, the sort of foreseeable consequences. And the Sherwood book that you read an excerpt from that gives a pretty good discussion of this. And so if you're interested in this, it's a pretty good place to go. So in 73, they were granted home rule rights. So it was, generally the same as other cities. They were able to have a council, city council, a mayor, and but it's a little different. So they did not have budget autonomy. So they had to send and this still is the case, they have to send their budget to Congress. Congress looks at it. Usually they don't do anything because, who wants to really mess with a city budget? That's kind of boring. And then they, once it's approved, or actually, they just, if they don't do anything, so if Congress doesn't do anything, then it is automatically approved. Once that happens, then the budget for the city is approved. So then there's also General House oversight, and the president appoints judges, so oftentimes judges in states are elected. But here, presidents appoint them in D.C. And there are also specific things, and you can still read this if you go online. You can look at some of these are very specific that you don't probably care about, but they can't institute a commuter tax. There's tons of commuters who come into DC, and so one of the conditions for giving them home rule rights was that they could not institute a tax, because generally they can institute taxes if they want, but this is the one restriction. And there's other specific matters that are off limits. They can't change the height restriction rule, for instance. There's some talk about changing that possibly. But so these are the restrictions, and because of the oversight, it seems like basically every time Congress turns over, there's a change in whether abortions can be allowed in DC. So it's often used as, or abortions be paid by the DC budget, essentially. So DC typically has a fund for those who can't afford abortions to pay for them. And when in 2010, when the Republicans took over the House, they restricted that. So they did not allow DC to pay for abortions from their own tax money. So as you can see, they don't have true autonomy, and this is a huge problem for a lot of people in DC. They really don't like this. They wish they could become a state, essentially. So we'll talk about that a little bit later, but let's move on to the economic aspect of this. So what's mostly interesting here is the economic pressures on cities. So and this is what's going to be most pertinent for the issue of whether cities should be considered growth machines. So if we think cities are growth machines, then they'll seek certain ends. So they'll seek to do certain things given the economic pressures they're under. So let's just start with this. So it's pretty obvious that in order for cities to function, they have to have money, right? So in order to pick up the trash, in order to pay social workers, in order to do the various things, in order to have a government, right? To have an office with a government, to have police, you need money to do this. And that requires a tax base, right? So you need people paying taxes, because that is where governments, generally, especially city governments, get their money, is from taxes. So the problem, though, is you can't just increase taxes to any level, because this will cause people to leave, because they'll say, well, I'm paying, say, half my income here, and I can pay only 6% or 7% if I move just outside the city or to another state. There's a great likelihood that they will not stay to pay those taxes. And so you have to balance how much in taxes you charge people. So this is sort of a balancing act that cities are going to face, and we'll discuss this in some detail. So the major source of taxes from cities is property taxes. So this goes along with Malacha's view that the stakeholders are really property owners, right? Are the elite, or at least those who own property. And for this reason, what the city really cares about are those who own property. They want that property increase in value, because then they'll have to pay more taxes, right? So the city really has incentive, if they want to increase the funds they have available and thus be able to do more things, they want to increase property values, and they want to basically get more money from property owners. So you might be thinking of other taxes that you pay often. You might not pay them, but some people do. So there's certainly state income taxes, right? So and sometimes those go directly to localities. So in Maryland, for instance, there's a 3% state tax and a 3% local tax. And that local tax goes directly to wherever you live, the jurisdiction, the county usually, or even the specific city where you live. Sometimes you don't do that. Sometimes you just pay a state tax, and that goes in the form of aid to various places. So you don't it doesn't go directly, but it goes through aid or something. And then because DC is strange, there's no state, it collects income taxes as well. But for these purposes, we'll mostly leave aside DC. DC is a kind of an odd duck. So let's not worry about that as much. So there's also other taxes, but most of these are state taxes. So and there's also there's a federal income tax, which we're just leaving out. So state taxes, state sales tax, most of that goes to the state. Sometimes there's a portion of that can be local, but it's not nearly as substantial as property taxes. And of course other fees, but these are tiny compared to what cities get in the form of property taxes. So DC also receives money directly from the federal government, and the reason this is because DC is full of federal property, and federal property does not, the federal government doesn't have to pay taxes on its property, essentially. So because DC is sort of losing out on this money, the federal government gives them aid, in a sense. So, actually the federal government often uses this as saying that DC is not self-sustaining, and that's because they're inefficient or something. But, really the reason why there's this aid is because DC is losing out on this money they should be getting in property taxes. And because property taxes are so important for local governments, it's a problem that they're not getting this. So that's how DC works. So what matters then for determining what tax rate you can charge without losing people is how porous your boundaries with other jurisdictions are, the tax rates of those jurisdictions, and how attractive they are to people. So this will be sort of the calculation that cities will have to make to determine whether they can raise taxes or they have to lower taxes. So here's a little example. Let's imagine we have 3 cities, A, B, and C here. And those 3 cities have boundaries, right? So they have limits where, if you have to go past this boundary to leave, right? So we can imagine that these boundaries are only relevant for people leaving. So the boundary to come into a jurisdiction is really easy, right? So they'll really let you in. They love it when you're coming into their city. And so these lines we'll think of as their boundaries, and they're color coordinated according to which boundary they are. And the thickness of these you could think of is how difficult it is to get past them. So this, it's a little abstract, but let's just imagine that these cities are identical in all ways, other than what we'll specify, right? So they're just as nice. They have same services. They have everything is the same, except at one moment, City C begins offering a 3% tax, whereas the other 2 only have 5% taxes. Let's imagine there's only one tax in this world, right? So just to make things simple. And also, C had a 5% tax before this moment. So, in order to keep their services going, they had to have a 5% tax, otherwise they wouldn't be the same as the other cities. But they have just lowered their tax. So, given that these boundaries, they're pretty thin, I've drawn them pretty thin. Given that those boundaries are pretty thin, it's easy to move from one city to the other. It's pretty easy to figure out what people will do, right? The people in cities A and B will seek to move to city C. So not all of them will, of course, but there will be a flow of people from A and B to C. So if you think growth is important, which seems like a maybe, right? Especially if the elites are the ones, the property owners are the ones in charge, and cities are, seeking to keep property holders and taxpayers. Then this is a problem for A and B, and we need to think about what they have to do to react to this. So this is the basic problem that cities face, is trying to stop this flood of people from their city to another city. So it's the first thing you need to appreciate is that cities and states can't really increase the barrier to move. So they can't make it harder to move from their city to another. This is especially true of cities within a single state, but it's also true of states. So in the Constitution, states are basically, it's specified that states cannot levy tariffs and such, right? So it's the federal government's job to regulate interstate commerce, and states themselves cannot put tariffs on other states. They can do other things, so they can sort of restrict what sort of things can come in their state. But generally, these do not prevent companies from moving or people from moving from one state to the other. It's actually very easy. You just pick up and go. And there'll be a cost associated with that. But oftentimes, if you're going to move into another city, they'll give you incentives and such. So the barriers are quite low. So it seems like, given that they can't increase barriers, the federal government can increase barriers between countries, right? And it's actually really difficult to move from one country to another. That's extremely costly. It seems like one of the few things they can do is lower their taxes, right? So they can lower their taxes to match C. So we see if they do that, this flow from A and B that we saw no longer occurs, and it goes back to the state it was before, where cities had their members and had their citizens, and they weren't moving around. So that looks fine, right? First of all, but let's we'll think about whether there's any problems with that. So, as I was saying, this equalizes the flow of individuals, but their total incomes will decrease. So it seems like now the problem is that you can't do what you were doing before. So all three cities were sort of doing the same thing. They provided the same services. It was what they wanted to do. Now, though, you can't provide those same services, so something must be cut. Of course, there'll be some efficiencies, right? So you might find some efficiencies and do things better, right, with needing less money doing the same things. But generally, that's not the case. You have to, lay off people or whatever. And the real worry is that this will end up being a spiral of lost income. So we can imagine what would happen if now, C is this really, they really want to cut taxes. They want all these people from A and B. And say they do it again, right? So say they change now. We were at 3% taxes. That the entire system had equalized to 3%. Now C is at 2%. So again, what we have is this flow from A and B to C. And so it's pretty predictable what will happen next. Basically, A and B will have to, match C. And so essentially what's going to happen is now they're going to all be at 2%. So this is how the spiral of lost income happens, because you can imagine that, now you're trying to attract more people. So now that we're down to 2%, how do you attract more people to get a larger tax base? Well, you might have to go down to 1%. So using that strategy, what ends up happening to this total system is that government income just decreases more and more. So the second strategy, so the first strategy is to lower taxes to match C. The second strategy, and this is a common one. So C seems, or the first strategy seems somewhat self-defeating, but it still occurs a lot. The second strategy, of course, is to increase the quality of the city. So we just stipulated that all the cities are the same quality. But what you might want to do, as like a mayor or something of these cities, is to try to make your city better. And even with your higher taxes, then, you might get people to come, or at least stop the movement of people to C. But this is sort of perilous as well, because it's hard to know whether it's going to work. So businesses understand what a tax rate is going to do to their profits, but it's really hard to quantify what quality of a city is going to do to the profits. So they can make some guesses, and you can try to convince them that it's going to do certain things to their business or for people, to their income or whatever. But it's maybe it'll increase the quality of their life of their employees, but it's unclear whether that'll increase their revenue. You might have a better time convincing people to move to your city because it's of higher quality. But even then, if there's no jobs or something, so if you haven't convinced the business people to move, it's still going to be difficult to go this way. So another way to work in conjunction with one of these two is for the state and federal governments to handle more taxation. So why would they do this? So what would they do? So essentially, they would take more money in the form of state or federal taxes, and then you could take less, and they would give you some. So they would provide aid, from federal aid or state aid, from the central state or federal government to these different cities. So everyone would get the same amount. And then you could have a smaller tax, right? So you'd still collect taxes as a city to do specific things, but this would be have a much lower impact. So this is essentially what we do. Every state, almost every state, perhaps some don't, maybe in the very conservative states in the South perhaps don't do this, but almost every state provides aid to local jurisdictions, to cities. And generally cities get the amount of aid they need, whatever that means, or everyone gets the same amount of aid. And so this sort of distributes it over states, and because people might be less likely to move to another state than to a neighboring city, or from a city to a suburb, which is the worst case, because it's so easy to move from a city to a suburb. The state might be able to get away with a higher tax rate. In the similar way, and even more effectively, the federal government can use taxes. They can tax at a higher rate than a city could manage, and then provide that money to the local jurisdictions. So this is generally what a scheme we use, and this helps to dampen the effects of those two choices that we have to make of taxation within cities. So that should give you some context when you're reading Malach's article. So this is really why we need to be concerned about whether a city is a growth machine, is because of how cities are under these economic political pressures. So the next lecture, I'll cover Malach's article itself. I'll sort of go into some of the details that might have been more difficult, and so it'll start off of what we've done today. And then, we'll think of what his criticisms are of this growth model and whether they can be answered. So, you might think a lot of what we do in cities is growth. Growth is important. It improves life for people. Malach doesn't think so. He seems to think that what's happening here is there's some transfer, basically, of goods, of quality of life or money itself from local residents to the elite. So people in corporations who come in or whatever and grow the local economy, they're getting more, and people who are already living there are actually getting less, he thinks. So we'll have to think deeply about whether we think he's right, because the typical view of economics is that it's not a zero-sum game. So Malach seems to think that, if some people are moving to one city, they must be coming from another, or if there's growth in one city, it must be coming from another city, that economic goods are distributed across the country and not sort of produced there. This includes jobs. that's kind of a radical view. The typical view of economics is that it's not a zero-sum game. That when you create jobs in a city, those jobs didn't come from somewhere else, right? It's not like you have negative jobs somewhere else that they came here, but they're actually created. So these are new jobs. And that a business-friendly environment that promotes growth actually creates more economic activity, and this isn't just taken from other parts of the country. So that's a standard model, and Malach is arguing against it. So that's a standard capitalist model, right? And Malach is arguing against this standard capitalist model. So you might also think that generally growth is good, and you could think of Jacob's view. It seems like she thinks that growth is good, and she's saying how cities can grow and be thriving, but we might need to constrain it. So we might need to rethink what exactly we want to get out of the growth, right? It seems like growth itself is not what we're interested in. It's something else, like quality of life or something. And see if we can modify the growth machine view to make it more to our liking. So I'll talk about that the next lecture, which should be up tomorrow. Make sure you are posting, your either questions. They should be 100 to 300 words, or comments about things, and saying something about what you think. So you should be doing that now, and then also commenting on other people's comments.